Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to FSMA Fridays. And our topic for today, the final rules for foreign supplier verification and produce rules. My name is Barbara Levin. I'm with Safety Chain. I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let me give you just a few housekeeping announcements. Everybody will receive the recording of today's session. You'll get a link via email on Monday. We have some pre-submitted questions, and we'll take as many questions as we can from the rest of you online after we go through the beginning of our presentation. For your privacy, you can see your name and the name of the host and the panelists, but not the names of the other attendees. We get asked about that a lot. Also, if you're having trouble hearing the audio through your speakers, if you go out of full screen and you'll see a quick start tab, you can hit that. It'll say, I will call in, and it will provide you with a phone number that you can call in and maybe get a little bit of a better audio quality. Our agenda for FSMA Fridays is simple as always. We've got some pre-planned and pre-submitted questions on today's topic. We're going to give you just a very high-level look at how the Acheson Group and Safety Chain can help you be FSMA ready on day one, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So with that, we're going to jump right in. Very excited, as always, to have our FSMA Friday team from the Acheson Group. Today we have with us Melanie Neumann, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer with Acheson and frequent FSMA Friday guest, and Rolando Gonzalez. Rolando is the Director of Scientific and Technical Affairs for the Acheson Group and has joined us for several FSMA Fridays recently. So Melanie and Rolando, welcome back, and as always, we are going to jump right in. Melanie, before we get into the topics for today, we always start FSMA Friday with just a general, what are the latest updates from FDA? So perhaps you can start us there.
Thanks, Barbara. Great to be back on FSMA Friday, and great to be here with my colleague, Rolando. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. And as we approach the Thanksgiving holiday, I just want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and wish all of our colleagues and listeners a happy Thanksgiving as well. Well, Barbara, just to answer your question, I think that one of the latest updates, obviously, is these late-breaking 3 rules that have been released from FDA, so that we finally have our roadmaps to compliance on 5 of the 7 rules now from FSMA. So we talk about these 7 pillars of FSMA, the 7 rules of FSMA, and we've got 5 of the 7 now. And we can start to, I think, breathe a little bit and start to digest 5 of these 7 because the last 2 aren't due until spring of 2016. So we can take a little time and start mapping out our roadmaps to compliance. So I think really that's the latest and greatest update. A few weeks ago, I spent some time at the FDA meeting in Chicago, where FDA came and spent all day with industry stakeholders and those who signed up to attend this meeting, and they laid out their roadmap with respect to what's now known as and coined as FSMA Phase 2 and FDA's plans for implementation of the preventive controls rule for humans and animals and those rules. And so that really gave us some great insights as to how FDA was planning to implement. They are laying out some great training for their own staff, their own inspectors, and really looking at performance metrics both internally for the inspectors themselves, and as well as really looking to us as industry to set performance metrics for ourselves as industry. And that's one of the measures that, frankly, Barbara, they're looking at to have us measure what we call food safety culture. So something that, frankly, I think in the past a lot of us in industry thought was a little bit fuzzy and amorphous is now really starting to get some metrics and measurements behind. So I think that really, frankly, is what I see as the updates on FSMA.
Great. Thank you, Mel. Let's go to Rolando. Welcome back to FSMA Fridays, and let's jump into the topic here and start out with the final produce rule. Can you give us, kind of a high-level summary of the key changes between what was in the proposed rule and what's in the final rule in terms of the produce rule's major components?
Absolutely, yeah, and thank you for the invitation again. I'm very happy to be here with the FSMA Fridays audience one more time. So to answer your question, when we look at the rule and we compare the proposed with the final produce safety rule, we see that actually they're following the same principles as were contained in the proposed rule. And let's recall that, this rule is the one that establishes the science-based standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding produce, and that it applies broadly to a wide diversity of produce farms. And they do that by addressing 6 main sections or 6 main elements, let's say, of farm and produce handling operations. The first one being agricultural water. And with that, they pretty much establish the criteria for the water quality that it's going to be used, obviously, for practices such as irrigation, which is so critical in produce growing and harvesting. And one of the things that they address there, for example, is the presence of generic E. coli as a potential indicator of fecal contamination. And they also talk about the general approach to testing untreated water used for certain purposes. As an example that I mentioned, the irrigation water, which has been the cause of certain issues in the past with cross-contamination of produce. The frequency of water testing, they still base it on the water source, so pretty much whether you're using surface water or groundwater. So this will be kind of the first key element that they address. Then second element there is the biological soil amendment. So pretty much if you're using raw manure, if you're using stabilized compost, they also define what the critical, let's say, parameters should be in regards to, for example, in the case of stabilized compost, what are the microbial standards for detectable amounts of bacteria, say Salmonella, E. coli, 15787, Listeria, etc. The same thing in the case of sprouts, for example, there are some new requirements, and those are based on the fact that obviously we do have greater concern with that type of commodity because it's been associated in the past with outbreaks of foodborne disease. The other elements include like domesticated and wild animals, and they're pretty much treating those, any animals that are used for like the grazing animals, so working animals in farms, the same standards should apply to those as they do for wild animals, intrusion of wild animals into the farms. There are requirements as well for worker training, health, and hygiene. So pretty much making sure that there is training associated with hand washing and measures to prevent contamination of produce and the food contact surfaces by, for example, ill workers who show up to work. And the last one being equipment, tools, and buildings, so requirements around those sources to prevent, for example, inadequate sanitation that could lead to potential cross-contamination of produce. So pretty much, again, mimicking what we saw in the proposed rule, that's what we see in the final rule, again, at the high level.
Great, thank you. Good summary. Melanie,
Sure.
Let's come back to you. Kind of the same question for the FSVP. There's been so much speculation about this. What are the key changes between the proposed and final rules in terms of FSVP major components?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. There was a lot of speculation on, how, for example, what's the definition of importer going to look like? There was a lot of speculation by industry that there was going to be some potentially big changes there, and a lot was going to pivot on that. And there really wasn't a big change on that. We're going to get to that in a minute, but notwithstanding, and I think as we learned from Rolando's coverage of the produce safety overview, there's a lot in these rules, folks. Maybe not a ton of huge game-changing, significant changes, but there's a lot in these rules that we still have to get our arms around, and frankly, they've been out for maybe a week. So we even haven't had a ton of time to get our arms around these rules, and so we're going to take a deep dive into each one of these rules separately and independently on subsequent FSMA Fridays. So do stay tuned. We know we're just scratching the surface. We're the first to admit we're scratching the surface on these rules as we dive into these. But to address your question, some of the key changes, for example, Barbara, to get your changes. The final rule gives more flexibility in this FSVP rule, for example, in meeting some of the verification requirements by the importer. So, for example, the importers can rely on evaluations or assessments by other parties if that importer actually assesses the documentation themselves. So you can't necessarily just take an assessment and file it away in a filing cabinet. But if, for example, you take another party's assessment and do a review of that, say a third-party audit, and do a review of that, you could rely on that audit going forward. So that illustrates that. There was some speculation or thought that the final rule might have exempted food contact substances from the final rule, and that did not happen. So that is still included in the final rule. So what does the foreign supplier verification requirements really look like? Really what it does require is that the importer has to have a foreign supplier verification program in place so that they can verify that the foreign suppliers are producing foods that's basically in compliance with U.S. food laws. And what does that boil down to? That basically they're producing food in compliance with the preventive controls rules and the produce safety rules. And that they're not adulterated or misbranded with regard to the allergen labeling laws. So that, in a nutshell, is really the importer's responsibility. And this rule really establishes accountability for the importer's role in the supply chain. And so one question that it kind of, begs to me, Barbara, is, and everyone on the phone is, how many importers who are not manufacturers and processors are going to be ready for this role, that really know and understand food? And the reason I ask this is because here's what the responsibilities are. The importers have to perform a hazard analysis to determine known and reasonably foreseeable hazards with each food. And then they have to evaluate that risk for each food based on the hazards and based on the foreign supplier's performance. That means they have to keep tabs on the suppliers and their performance on an ongoing basis. And then based on that hazard analysis and based on that foreign supplier's performance, they've got to set appropriate verification activities. So they've got to have their finger on the pulse of the hazards of the foreign supplier's behavior and set appropriate verification activities to control that hazard. And then can actually conduct those verification activities and conduct corrective actions if things are going off the rails. So those are the set of the importer's responsibilities under this foreign supplier verification program. And again, I go back to, for especially importers who are not manufacturers and processors, meaning they're not really those who control and handle and manage food on a day-to-day basis, do they really know and understand those hazards to that level of a degree that they can control those risks so well? Okay. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on real briefly, for those importers who are manufacturers and processors, those folks, you are going to be deemed compliant with these requirements under foreign supplier verification if you are already in compliance with the supply chain program under the preventive controls rule. So we've kind of got that. Of course, there's going to be the exemptions. Again, we could go on and on, but that's going to be the high-level proposition with respect to the requirements under the final rule of foreign supplier verification.
Great summary, Melanie. And don't go away because the next question deals with something you alluded to just a few minutes ago. What is the definition of importer under the final FSVP? Because people haven't been quite sure what that looks like yet.
Sure. Really, to me, it wasn't a lot of change. The definition per se, Barbara, and this will sound scripted, but I'm just going to read it just so everybody knows what the true definition it's the U.S. owner or consignee of the food offered for import into the United States. Now, if there is no U.S. owner or consignee, the importer is defined as the U.S. agency or representative of the foreign owner or consignee at the time of entry, as confirmed in a signed statement of consent. So, it's a mouthful, but it's not really fundamentally changing much from proposed to final. Again, there are exemptions, so those who are importing juice or seafood under juice and seafood HACCP, those are exempt. We've got some other exceptions again under this rule, but notwithstanding that, that's where the definition really netted out.
Thank you. Let's see, let's come back to Rolando for this next question. We're asking who is impacted by these rules and how long do companies have to be compliant? And I know we've got a chart with some dates, so just let me know when you'd like me to advance to that slide.
Yeah, if you want to advance to it now, Barbara, that would be great.
Okay.
So as we see, I mean, they were published now in November. The sooner the companies will need to comply with any of these rules, it's going to be pretty much 1 year from this month, so November 2016. Now, between the produce rule and the foreign supplier verification program, there are some differences there. And I guess part of your question was, you know, who do these rules apply to? So definitely in the case of produce, we know that they apply to fruits and vegetables normally consumed raw, such as, let's say, apples, carrots, lettuce, for example, and obviously any operations who grow, harvest, pack, or hold those commodities. There are exemptions, such as Melanie was mentioning in the case of foreign supplier verification program. In the case of produce, safety rule is the same thing. For example, any produce that is not a raw agricultural commodity will be exempt. Those operations will be exempt from complying with this rule. Any foods identified as rarely consumed raw, for example, those are also exempted. Food grains, personal or own farm consumption of the produce is also exempted. Farms with an average sales volume of less than 20 or sales dollars, less than $25,000 per year, those are also exempted. And any produce that receives commercial processing to pretty much reduce the presence of microorganisms, particularly pathogens, are also exempted from it. There are also some qualified exemptions or modified requirements. I mean, we would go into detail those when we touch on these more specifically. But in terms of compliance dates, then if you don't qualify for any of those exemptions, it's pretty much staggered, just as we saw with the preventive controls rules. It's based on business size. And it depends. So very small farms, for example, they get 4 years to comply with it. Then small businesses, 3 years, and then the rest of the farm operations that do not fall under any one of those two, then they get 2 years. Then they also have an additional 2 years to fulfill the water quality requirements that I was talking about a few minutes ago. When it comes to the sprout operations, and I said that those will definitely have a higher concern with those, then they will have less time to come into compliance with the rule that if you were growing anything else, any other produce item. They will have pretty much anywhere from 1 to 3 years to comply based on the size of their operation, and they will have no additional time to comply or to fulfill the water requirements. So that is in regards to the produce rule. Now, the foreign supplier verification, so as Melanie was saying, it applies to any importer food that is presented for importation into the U.S. or the U.S. consignee if there is no importer of that food. There are some exemptions, as she mentioned. For example, anyone importing dietary supplements, it's exempt from these. At least, they need to comply with some modified requirements, which is pretty much the compliance with GMPs or good manufacturing practices. Like Melanie mentioned as well, anyone being regulated by juice HACCP or seafood HACCP, any food that is presented for research or evaluation or for personal consumption or alcoholic beverages, all of that is it's pretty much exempt. But in the case of foreign supplier verification program in regards to compliance dates, they have pretty much, in general, 18 months from the date of publication of the final rule to comply with it. Now, if the supplier is subjected to the preventive controls rules or the product safety rules, then they have pretty much 6 months after the supplier of that food is required to meet the relevant regulations. And that, like Melanie was mentioning as well, if this importer is also a manufacturer of food, then and if they are subjected to supply chain controls under the preventive control rules regulations, then the compliance deadline is pretty much a date in which or by which they have to comply with those provisions. So, and then obviously with the preventive control rules, there was a lot of detail in regards to the schedule for compliance based on business size and some other considerations. So that's pretty much the idea of when companies need to comply to. There's different timelines, depends on business size, and it depends, of course, on the rule that we're talking about.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's go to you, Melanie, for the last of the questions that were pre-planned. And this is a big question, right? What should companies be doing now to ensure that they are compliant on that first day, as Rolando just outlined for us?
Well, first of all, don't wait. I think now that we see 5 out of the 7 rules, just how complex they are, how significant and large they are, it's really sending the message that both Safety Chain and TAG collectively on all these FSMA Fridays leading up until now have jointly echoed time and time again is don't wait. Start now, create your FSMA team, and determine which rules apply to you. So in essence, do a gap analysis to determine where you're at now and where you need to get before your compliance date. Figure out what is your date. Your colleague Barbara, Jill Bender, and I, we just did a presentation at the Food Safety Consortium the other day, and our theme was, what's your number? So figure out, what is your number? What's your date? What's your number? What's your target? What do you have to hit? And work your way backwards and develop your plan now, because there's so many moving parts. We figured that it takes 110 hours to develop your food safety plan, just under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. You couple that and you add these rules of foreign supplier verification on top of that, if that applies to you, or if produce safety applies to you, you're producing so many more records, so many more verification and monitoring documents, that each one of those, FDA did a burden per hour analysis of each type of document you have to generate as a business, and you're adding a lot of time, labor hours, records, and record-keeping requirements that if, waiting is just not going to help you out, let's put it that way. And determine if you are an importer under the definition of importer of foreign supplier verification. If you are, start tackling this rule now. See if you need to comply with it versus the requirements of supplier controls in the preventive controls rule for humans, for example. These are the questions you can start tackling now, folks, to be ready by your compliance date. Or let TAG know or Safety Chain know if they can help you out. The guidance documents FDA said are probably not going to be released until at least Q1 of 2016. That really eats into your compliance dates if you've got to hit September 2016 for some of these rules, like for PC rule for humans and animals, for example. Mike Taylor, made a good suggestion saying read the comments and the responses out of these rules. Because they may have addressed your question, but notwithstanding, and read the updated Q&As that get posted on the FDA website. Those are some good tips and guidance that we can give you to see if your particular questions have been asked and answered by FDA. They certainly have given some tools to industry to ask the Technical Assistance Center at FDA on particular questions. You can submit a question directly to FDA as well, or you can submit your questions to TAG. And frankly, we're faster. So I would encourage you to let us know if you have a question, but also encourage you to ask FDA as well. But really the message being, don't wait to ensure your compliance, because FDA is really training up their inspectors very specifically to these rules. I think as an industry, we have become, I think, very used to the inspector of old who have come in and been very much a generalist. Maybe they've had med device background experience or pharma experience, and they've come in to inspect a food facility, and they've known just enough to kind of get by in that audit. And it's by no means a negative comment. It's just been what it was. And now they are armed. They are ready. FDA has done a bang-up job of training their inspectors on these PC rules, at least the PC rules for humans and animals. They know what to look for. They know what to ask for in these food safety plans. We have to be ready, folks. So please, if you heard nothing else on this particular FSMA Friday, know that these inspectors are coming in. They hired inspectors with food industry experience. They trained them up with food background and food training. They are trained in these PC rules, and they know what they are going to be looking for. So we have to be ready. Build your teams, get ready, build your roadmaps to compliance, and let us know how we can help you. Barbara, back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melanie. What we're going to do now is get questions from our audience queued up. Everybody should be able to see that we're out of full screen right now, and you should be able to see the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Simply enter your question there and hit send. I will tell you that our team is traveling today, and we don't have time for a ton of questions. We'll get to as many as we can, and as Melanie said earlier, we will be doing much deeper dives into all of these topics when we've had time to really dig through the rules. Very quickly, let me give you some information about your sponsors for today, starting with the Acheson Group. The Acheson Group really is the premier consulting organization with FSMA expertise. They can help you understand which rules apply to you. They can help you build your FSMA food safety plan and make sure that you can leverage what you have that fits. What to have ready for FDA when they ask to see your plan. Talk to you about GFSI and your GFSI strategy in terms of being FSMA ready, and so much more. If you'd like more information on how the Acheson Group can help you with these and many other areas of FSMA preparedness, you can contact Lindsay Nix at the Acheson Group, and that's lindsay@achesongroup.com, and you'll have this on the slides, and then the email, when you get the recording link, will have that contact info as well. Safety Chain's dedicated platform for food safety along all parts of your supply chain, Safety Chain for Food, is a comprehensive automation solution to help you be compliant with FSMA. This includes vendor approval, program management, and supply chain controls in terms of everything supplier compliance, automation of your HACCP and HARPC programs, and a central repository of all of your food safety and quality data so that you're audit ready on demand. You can produce records to the FDA on demand and have the data that you need for continuous improvement as well as audit readiness. As we said earlier, you'll get a recording link on Monday that will have the recording from today as well as all of the contact information. Next month on Friday, December 18th, we're going to have our FSMA Friday be on what to expect for FSMA in 2016. We'll also announce our 2016 FSMA Friday topics, at least for the first few months, and as Melanie said, I think we can expect to do much deeper dives into these new rules that were just announced within the last week. Safety Chain's GFSI Leadership Series is still underway. You can get more information on that on our website. If you're going to be at the NLS Food Quality Symposium in San Antonio a week after Thanksgiving, we look forward to seeing you there. TAG is doing a training, a deep dive training on preventive control for human food, the concepts of HACCP to HARPC. That is going to be on Wednesday, December 18th. I believe that's right after FSMA Friday. You can see the Acheson Group website there and get information for signing up for that. And with that, let's get to some of the questions that we have. Excuse me. Melanie, question for you from Kenley that was sent in earlier. If a foreign company does not have a GFSI certification by September 2016, will that company be barred from exporting to the U.S.? This is a company that exports fresh produce.
Good question. Well, first of all, GFSI audits per se GFSI audits are not required by regulation, but an audit may be required, and it depends on the risk. So really what we need to do, first of all, is start by the premise of doing a hazard evaluation, determining that known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, for example. And if that rises to the level of a serious, basically a Class 1 equivalent or a serious adverse health consequence or death, and an audit's required, then a variety of different audits can rise to the level of satisfying that requirement. A GFSI audit is one of them. A third-party audit, I should say, is one of them, and GFSI could be one of them. So if they don't have a GFSI audit, what else could you accept? You could do your own second-party audit. So you could send an internal auditor of your own there to do that audit, or a government audit can suffice as well. So those are some of the things that you could do as far as like a workaround, if you still want to and or need to receive that product into the U.S. But the way the question was worded is if they don't have a GFSI audit, are they barred? And the true per se answer would be no, because a GFSI audit per se isn't required.
Okay. Let's see. Melanie, I'm going to stick with you for another question here from Fatima. As you mentioned, it's the responsibility of the importer of record or consignee to do a hazard analysis and evaluate the risk. What if we use brokers to import commodities? Who would be responsible to do the hazard analysis and risk evaluation in that case?
Well, it all pivots on who the importer is under the definition of this rule. So if the broker is deemed the importer of record and the importer under foreign supplier verification, then they're the ones who would be determining the hazards and performing this hazard evaluation. So it goes back to the definition of importer. If that broker serves as that definition, then they would be doing it. If you as the manufacturer or processor are, then you would be performing it. It's also, I think, important to note that it also depends on the use of the product as well. It's also going to be very, I guess where I'm going with this is that importers are not, you don't need, if a preventive control is needed, then you're not going to need to perform this as well.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So if somebody's controlling it downstream, like with a further processing step.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Melanie. Rolando, from Scott, under the produce rule, there's clear verbiage concerning food contact surfaces. So will harvesting equipment, such as automated pickers, have environmental monitoring programs to evaluate hazard evaluation on the farm level?
That's a great question, and so there is, as part of the elements that I was mentioning originally, that the 6 elements that the rule calls for, there is equipment, tools of buildings, and there is definitely a requirement to make sure that those are not the source of potential cross-contamination. So there has to be adequate sanitation of those. There has to be some level of protection, let's say, to avoid that. So in regards to a way to assessing the effectiveness of that cleaning and sanitation process, there is multiple ways in which you can do that. I mean, it could be just a visual inspection. It could be environmental monitoring. They don't necessarily or specifically require environmental monitoring, but for you to be able to verify that you are doing adequate sanitation and that those environments are not harboring potential bacteria that could cross-contaminate the product, then environmental monitoring could be one of the monitoring activities that you could have or would need to be using to be able to confirm that that sanitation process has been effective. But no official requirement for environmental monitoring clearly stated in the rule.
Okay, great, thank you. Melanie, one last one for you. Ed is asking, based on the FSVP, will Customs be doing anything differently?
Good question. I haven't gotten, really definitive word on the street if Customs is going to be doing anything differently. I have a feeling that they're going to up their inspections and up their game too. Wouldn't be surprised. Rolando, have you heard anything?
I haven't heard anything specific about that, Melanie. At least not yet.
Okay.
We'll keep our ear to the pavement, though. That's a great question.
Okay, and keep coming to FSMA Friday. We'll try to dig out that answer and get it. Several people are asking, Rolando, can you repeat the compliance dates for both of these rules we're discussing today, FSVP and produce rules? So I've gone back to the slide, so we can look at that real quickly one more time.
Absolutely, yeah. So for produce rule, it was based on the size of the business, so starting with small farms, 4 years to comply, then small businesses, 3 years, and then the rest of the operations, 2 years, so 4-3-2. The only exception to that is if we're talking about sprouts, that would be a 3-2-1, which is more similar to what we see in the preventive control rules for human and animal food. So 4-3-2 for just produce, an additional 2 years for the water quality requirements only, and then in the case of sprouts, a 3-2-1 scheme similar to preventive controls rules. And then in the case of foreign supplier verification program, in general, most companies will have 18 months to comply from the date of publication of the final rule. But then there is two conditions here that we need to consider. If the supplier of that food is also or it's subjected to preventive controls or produce safety rules, then they have 6 months after that foreign supplier is required to meet the relevant regulations. So let's say they have a year to comply with the rules, and there is an additional 6 months that then the importer will need to comply with the rule. And then the last point to consider there is that if the importer is also a manufacturer, then what will apply is the timeline that they need to follow for the supply chain applied controls under the preventive controls regulation. So whichever date applies to them based on business size, that's what pretty much will be the compliance deadline for FSVP in that case.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I am sorry, folks, I know we have more questions, but as I said, as you can hear from some of the static, our team is traveling today. We will we'll make the Q&A longer for the next session so that we can get to more of your questions. We'll do a deeper dive on these topics. Look out for those dates. Everybody have a fabulous Thanksgiving holiday. Remember to cook your turkeys to the right temperature. And we'll see everybody on December 18th. Where the team will be looking at what to expect from FSMA in 2016. Thank you, everybody, and happy holiday.